Do you think it's strange that majority of the ancient civilization sites around the world, number one, are all megalithic, meaning they have giant stone construction, and number two, the majority of them have pyramids? Is there a reason that man separated by oceans back in ancient day all came to the same conclusion as far as building construction? Is it mere coincidence, or is there something more to it? Is there a bigger picture that's going on here? The history that we've been told is not the history at all. It is a manipulated history that is what they want us to believe. So our journey today is to get through some of those lies and to get to some truth. Show you the division of man and the migration over time, pre-flood, when all we have are stories and myths and legends to go off of, but as we put it all together, we see that it actually is a full picture of one story and a full picture of another story. And those two stories, the division still carries on today. And that's what this video series is going to help to highlight, where we've come from, where we're going, how it all worked out. How did ancient man come up with the same ideas? Human sacrifice, building, construction, pantheonic gods. So the story begins in Genesis, when Adam's created, fall from the garden, Adam and Eve. Where did they live after the garden? If you're familiar with the book of Adam and Eve at all, it breaks down the story quite well and in much detail. Not canonized scripture, but a valuable source for his history and a general idea. And the more you get outside of the canon, you get a better picture of the parts of the story that we don't understand quite so well. So the book of Adam and Eve goes, paraphrasing obviously, they are kicked out of the garden and live on a mountaintop that has sea to the north and to the east, rivers to the south that are fed from the garden, a vast area to the west. In the days of Cain and Abel, Cain killed Abel, was deceived by evil spirits, possibly, and Cain was cast out. Where did Cain go? Did he just disappear off the face of the earth? No. When the Israelites came out of Egypt, they sent spies into the land of Canaan. There was obviously some genealogical connection there, even after the flood. And Cain was a couple thousand years before the flood even happened. So we have to understand that Cain was cast out from the holy people. And if you believe the book of Adam and Eve, he was cast out with his sister. And Cain and his sister created their own civilization down from the mountain in the valley. And God's specific instruction to the holy people on the mountain was not to intermingle with Cain and his kind. And that became even more so as the generations went on. Why is that? Well, then we have to look back at some of the prehistory to all this and who was here. Obviously, Satan and his minions were here at that time because Satan came to Adam and Eve in the garden to deceive them, which was well before this time. Which brings up a whole nother question. What was Satan? He obviously was not a serpent at the time, because God's curse on him was that he would crawl on his belly and suck the dust of the earth. Well, if a snake already does that, then how is that a curse? It's not. He was something else. More likely than not, a dragon. They refer to him as a dragon in Revelations a few different times and other places in the Bible. So there we have our first point of lore and the story possibly coming together, giving us an idea that maybe these old legends aren't exactly the truth, but there is some truth in them. So learning those stories and learning those ideas gives us insight into the bigger picture that was going on. And the bigger picture that was going on was that Satan and his fellow fallen angels had already been cast to the earth at this point. Where were they? What were they doing? Well, we obviously know that they were possessing animals. But why were they possessing animals? Because they needed a physicality in this world to do anything in this world. If you're a spirit, you merely influence or work in spiritual ways. It's the difference between Adam and the angels is that Adam has a physicality connected to his spiritual side, and they are just spirits. So they needed a physicality to work in this physical world. So what we ended up with at that point was all kinds of animal to animal defilement, crossbreeding, and all of those things. That's all that Satan and his minions had up to that point. But then enter Cain and his wife and their settlement. Then that was the game changer. Because then Satan had humans, had God's DNA. And that was why it was such an importance for the holy people not to intermingle with Cain and his people after he left the mountain, because who knows what they were getting into at that point. I mean, look at some of these old creatures from Greek mythology, minotaurs and centaurs and fauns and all kinds of defilement of God's creation at every single level. So bad that God separated 8 people who had kept 5 people who had kept to his word and stayed pure on the mountain. Who Noah's daughters were remains to be seen. Were they part of the holy mountain, or were they part from the settlement? I'm leaning more towards the latter, because how did all of this information, how did all of this lineage, how did all of these mysterious secrets that were shared with man by the demons, how was that carried through the flood? But the point of the flood was this whole world was so defiled, even the animals, that God said, I'm not even keeping all the animals. I'm going to send a male and a female to you, and whatever shows up, that's what I want left on the earth. And you people. Everything else destroyed. So that gives you an insight into how disgusting things actually got in those times, and gives you a deeper insight into why animal worship is so big in all of the pantheonic religions. So that gives you some insight into why a lot of for instance, the pantheonic gods from Egypt A lot of them were all different animals. Alligators, birds, dogs, jackals, cats. So with that being said, you have to look at some of the ancient historical stories. Stories from areas like the Indus region in northern India, the Mesopotamian region in Iraq and Iran, the Giza Plateau in Egypt. All of these places all have a story, and these stories are all very similar. Not to say that they are the same story, because there were a lot of fallen angels, and there was a lot of pride and all that, and the pride in all of that drove them to different areas of the earth to try it their own way, to be their own gods, to have their own pantheon. And they did. But there are distinct similarities between all of these ancient civilizations, spanning thousands of miles apart. Symbology, their building structures, the way they built their structures, the reason for their structures, the carvings and hieroglyphs all over those structures. What is it? What is the point? Why have giant megalithic structures all over the earth, covered in history? What is the point of all that? And that's what we're here to answer today. The point of all that is that Satan knew that his time on this world was limited. He only had X amount of days before God took him away from his throne of power here physically on the earth. And I know it's a big debate between people about the Nephilim and the sons of God going down to the daughters of men. But how exactly, number one, does a spirit have sexual intercourse with a physical entity? And an even greater point to make with that is that if Satan could literally have sex with a woman, he would have defiled the entirety of womankind a number of times over at some point. He has no self-control, and his whole goal here is deception and corruption of everything, of the creation itself, all the way down to the DNA. Because what is DNA? DNA is what we have from God. God literally cloned himself, cloned his DNA from his self to make Adam, and then literally told us that he cloned Adam with his own bone to make Eve. So, in essence, our DNA is shared with God. It is God. So, to corrupt the DNA, to force it to mutate, is corrupting God in Satan's eyes. And was the goal, is the goal, will be the goal, until this all plays out. The point that brings it all back and ties it all together is that we have to understand that before the flood, they had thousands of years to work things out. And not only that, but you had a large group of fallen angel entities that were capable of possessing people and possessing animals and possessing inanimate objects, whatever they want to go into. they can go into, except for man. Man had to allow that to happen. Man had to allow them to come into them and continually work through them. And that's what set the men of renown apart. It wasn't the fact that they were offspring of angels. And honestly, in my opinion, I feel like in Enoch, when he made a point to say that's what happened, he was trying to hide the fact of what really happened, which was in the time of Jared, his father, he watched a large portion of God's holy people who had lived on the mountain for thousands of years be deceived down into Cain's settlement, intermixing with them, intermixing with their DNA and the corruption that had been being done for thousands of years at that point. You have to understand how advanced that civilization off of the mountain, Cain's civilization, and the civilizations that the fallen angels had already started preparing. Eridu, Baalbek, Sippur. I mean, if you look back in Mesopotamian history, Sippur, which was part of Ur, was known as the landing pad. So all of the cities from Eridu up to Sippur, 6 in all, were in a perfect straight line. And they were leading the way to the landing pad. It was a giant airport with cities marking the way to the landing area. Which, you get into ancient history from Central and South America, and you come across flying airplane-like statues. You get into the Vedas and the Illumined Sage books in Hinduism, and there are flying craft. All of those histories are telling a story, but it's not the story that you think, and it's not the people that you think. It's not the people that they are telling you in those stories that they are. It's much more sinister, and it's much darker. Just like the reality of our lives today. There's a lot of evil and a lot of darkness in this world, and it's all hidden. And it's hidden well, because we're dealing with an extremely smart individual in Lucifer. And he knows the secrets, and he knows the mysteries, and he's been sharing that knowledge with man since the beginning of time. Started with Adam and Eve. He tempted them to eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil.